In this video, we're going to talk about a very influential female writer, Aphra Behn. Now, Aphra Behn's works are not for the faint-hearted. They are rather racy, so you've been warned before we start. Aphra Behn lived in the Restoration period, and we heard a little bit about that earlier. She lived between 1640 and 1689. She was a poet, a playwright, and a spy, as we'll hear later. And she was also a translator, and she was one of the first professional female writers in English. Of course, women had written before her, and women had actually written plays before her and published plays, but she was the first one to make a living out of it, and who was actually really commercially successful. She was one of the leading dramatists of her time. Charles II had sent her to Antwerp as a spy during the Second Anglo-Dutch Wars. We're going to hear a little bit about that. But that's actually a period of her life we know something about, because she created a kind of mystique around herself and obscured certain facts, and actually we don't know very much about her life. She may have spent a brief stay in debtor's prison, but that could be part of the legend. When she began writing for the theatre after this stay in debtor's prison, which may or may not have happened, she used the pseudonym Astrea, and that was after a Greek goddess of purity and precision as well as of justice. She was part of the very libertine social circle of John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester, famously known as a Restoration rake. She got into legal trouble during the exclusion crisis, stemming from a prologue and epilogue that she wrote. So the exclusion crisis, as we will recall, is when the Whigs in Parliament wanted to exclude Prince James, the King's brother, from the succession because Charles II had no children. But James was a Catholic, and this party really didn't want Catholics on the throne. There was a certain anti-Catholic feeling in the English population. Behn was very much a royalist and very much anti-Whigs, pro-Tory. She believed that James should be the next king, and indeed he was, became James the Seventh of Scotland and second of England, although he was deposed in the Glorious Revolution and replaced with his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, who became William the Third of England. She was very much a political campaigner, and her works are quite political. She also wrote prose and translations as well as drama. Behn was dedicated enough to the cause of the Tories and to the succession of James that when she was asked by the famous intellectual Bishop Burnet to write a poem for the accession of William III, she refused, which at the time was considered a mad thing to do, but she never gave up on her beliefs. She actually died shortly after this. So Virginia Woolf said in the 20th century in her novel A Room of One's Own, "All women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, which is most scandalously, but rather appropriately, in Westminster Abbey, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds." So Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey is where people who have made a notable contribution towards the arts in England are buried. Now, that's not where Aphra Behn is buried, but the fact that she's buried in Westminster Abbey is, of course, acknowledging her importance. Although her works had actually fallen from favour for a time, she was considered too raunchy by some, and her works not developed enough by others. But actually in the 21st century, she's starting to be studied as a proto-feminist, a proto-novelist, someone whose works have something interesting to say, as we'll find out later. Her most famous works are her novel Orinoco, or The Royal Slave, which I read as part of my degree, and any of you who've done a degree in English will probably have encountered this work. Also her play The Rover. We don't have much information about Behn's early life, and it could be that she purposefully obscured it. She's believed by some to be the daughter of a barber and his wife John and Amy Amos. Other reports state her family were named Cooper. It could be that Behn herself didn't want us to know who her parents were, but in a book published in 1696, a few years after her death, The Histories and Novels of the Late Ingenious Mrs. Behn, we are told that Behn was born to one Bartholomew Johnson, who was a barber, and Elizabeth Denham, who was a wet nurse. What the truth is, we just don't know. The only person purporting to have known Behn during her childhood, one Colonel Thomas Culpeper, states that she was born in either Surrey or Canterbury and that her father was a Mr. Johnson. He stated that she had a sister called Frances. Another contemporary of Behn's, named Anne Finch, believed she was born in Eye in Kent, and she was the daughter of a barber. Another account again says that she had a brother named Edward who died at the age of only 6. So, a bit of confusion there. We do know that the letters that she wrote to William Scott reveal that she had spent time in an American colony in the Suriname that she describes in Orinoco. And we're going to hear a little bit about her relationship with William Scott later. It got her into some trouble. We are not so sure how Behn, who was not from an affluent or aristocratic background, managed to obtain an education. It could be that she was self-educated, that seems most likely, but her parents would have had to have facilitated this because she had to get the books from somewhere. She may have copied poems and other texts and so became familiar with literature. Behn's plays show her disdain for the idea that women were not to be educated. You know, that it was actually considered not worth educating a woman. That's something she really rallies against. She also held the view that learning Latin and Greek, which was foundational to the education of the day, was not the most important component of a good education. Now, the academic and author Janet Todd has said of Behn that she has a lethal combination of obscurity, secrecy, and staginess, which makes her an uneasy fit for any narrative, speculative or factual. She is not so much a woman to be unmasked as an unending combination of masks. So if you try to study the life of Aphra Behn, you might find it's a bit like being in a maze, basically. Now, Behn may have married John Behn, also referred to as Johann Behn, in 1664, and either he died or they separated quite soon after that. But she continued to use the name Mrs. Behn as her professional name. Behn had many Catholic connections, and remember, to be Catholic at the time was basically to be anti-establishment. She called herself designed for a nun, which when you read her plays is a bit difficult to believe, to be honest. But she also associated with the politician and author Henry Neville, who was actually arrested for his Catholicism. Perhaps through her acquaintance with Thomas Culpeper, Behn started to move in court circles after about 1666. Her social connections at this time are what led her to her famous mission in the Netherlands as a spy. The Second Anglo-Dutch War had begun in 1665, and Behn's mission to Antwerp is one of the best documented periods of her life. It's something that we actually know about. Astrea was her code name, although she was also known as Agent 160. She was to establish a relationship with William Scott. Now, he was the son of the regicide Thomas Scott, one of the men who had signed the death warrant of Charles I. And of course, Charles II, when he retook the throne, was gunning for the people that had basically killed his father. So he sends Behn to form a relationship with Scott in the belief that Scott could be convinced to report the affairs of English exiles in the Netherlands who were plotting against the king. So when Behn arrived in Bruges in 1666, it was actually a pretty good time to be leaving London. The Great Fire of London was in 1666, which had destroyed much of the city, and there was also an outbreak of plague, so it wasn't a happy place to be. But she wasn't prepared for the cost of living in Antwerp. She actually had to sell her jewellery to afford to be able to live there. Now, the king was pretty slow in paying her wages, let alone her expenses, and when she returned back to London, she made a case to him that she was owed money, and that seems to have fallen on deaf ears. We actually don't know if he ever paid her, and a warrant was issued for her arrest. So that story of her being in debtor's prison may or may not be accurate, but it's definitely part of her legend. So after this, she needed to earn money, so she became a scribe for two theatre companies, the King's Company and the Duke's Company. Wikipedia, which remember is not always an accurate source of academic information, but this puts it quite well. Under Charles, prevailing Puritan ethics were reversed in the fashionable society of London. The king associated with playwrights that poured scorn on marriage and the idea of consistency in love. Among the king's favourites was the Earl of Rochester, John Wilmot, who became famous for his cynical libertinism. So if you were going to do well as a playwright in London, you wanted to write things that were a bit racy, because that's what Charles II liked, and then of course that became the fashion. Behn was not actually the first published female playwright in England. Lady Elizabeth Carey had published The Tragedy of Miriam in 1613, and in the 1650s, Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle upon Tyne, had published 2 volumes of plays, but Behn was the first that did it for a living and made a commercial success out of it. Women actually couldn't perform on the stage until after the English Civil War, but in the Restoration period, actresses and professional actresses were coming to the fore, and some of them became quite famous. In 1668, it became possible for plays written by a woman to be staged in London. Behn's first play was called The Forced Marriage or The Jealous Bridegroom, and it was performed by the Duke's Company in 1670. It was a tragicomedy on the topic of arranged marriages, and it ran for 6 nights, and that was considered quite good actually for a playwright's debut. Her play, The Amorous Prince, was staged 6 months later, and it again covered the topic of arranged marriages. Behn didn't try to hide her gender from the public. She didn't pretend that she wasn't a woman, and she didn't take up a sort of gender neutral pseudonym such as, say, J.K. Rowling. But when her play The Dutch Lover was performed by the Dorset Garden Theatre in 1673, it was sabotaged by critics because she was a woman. Behn wrote a reply in the epistle to the reader, arguing that women had been stymied by their exclusion from education, and they actually had the potential to write, they just didn't have the education. Behn's relationship with the bisexual lawyer John Hoyle, though, gave her critics a scandal with which to attack her, and The Dutch Lover subsequently failed, unfortunately. And there are no records of Behn's life for another 3 years after that, until 1676. She then moved towards comedy, which was a greater commercial success for her. Between 1676 and 1677, she published Abdelazer, the Town Fop, and her most famous play, The Rover. She published Sir Patient Fancy in 1678. She was actually accused of plagiarising The Rover, and she endured attacks on her morality and her private life. So in the preface to Sir Patient Fancy, she pointed out that male playwrights could write salacious plays and no one would pass comment, and they could be involved in public scandals without the same level of vitriol which was accorded to Behn because she was a woman. Nonetheless, by the end of the 1670s, Behn was one of the leading dramatists in England. Her plays were frequently staged, and Charles II was known to attend. The Rover was actually a favourite play at the royal court. Behn befriended many other notable writers of the day, including John Dryden, Elizabeth Barry, John Hoyle, of course, Thomas Otway, and Edward Ravenscroft. And she was a member of the Earl of Rochester's salacious social circle. During the 1678 so-called Popish plot, which was a sort of mass hysteria regarding the Catholicism of Charles's brother James, it was like an invented plot intended to make the English people think that the Catholics were coming to take over. And during that time, Behn was very much part of the public debate. At this time, political parties developed in England. The Whigs, who wanted to exclude James from the succession, and the Tories, or the Conservatives, who wanted to conserve the succession the way that it stood. Between 1681 and 1682, Behn wrote 5 plays to discredit the Whigs, so her writing was very political. She was very much a royalist, and when Parliament denied money to the king, Behn wrote, "In public spirits called, good of the Commonwealth, so though by different ways the fever seize, in all 'tis one mad disease." So the London public actually contained a large number of Tory sympathisers, and so her plays were popular despite the fact that they were political. However, Charles II issued a warrant for Behn's arrest when she went too far and criticised his illegitimate son James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, who was favoured over James as Charles's heir by Whig sympathisers. This criticism had actually been published anonymously in Romulus and Hercilia in 1682. Despite her success, Behn's final years were plagued by debt and poverty. She continued to write, but her health was failing and it became increasingly difficult for her to actually hold a pen. Theatre audiences were in decline as well, and so theatres began producing older plays, for example Shakespeare, in order to try and get the numbers back up. Despite this, Behn's play The Lucky Chance appeared in 1686. In its preface, she wrote a long defence of women writers. Here's part of it. "Had the plays I have writ come forth under any man's name, and never known to have been mine, I appeal to all unbiased judges of sense. If they had not said that person had made as many good comedies as any one man that has writ in our age, but a devil onto the woman damns the poet. All I ask is the privilege for my masculine part and the poet in me. And that's from the preface to The Lucky Chance. One of Behn's longest running plays, The Emperor of the Moon, was staged in 1687. She had also begun to publish prose in 1680 with the three-part Love Letters Between a Nobleman and His Sister, which was published anonymously between 1684 and 1687. These were inspired by the real-life society scandal of Lord Grey, who had eloped with his sister-in-law, Lady Henrietta Berkeley. The work went through more than 16 editions before 1800, so pretty popular then. Other prose works by Behn include The Lover's Watch, 1686, The Fair Jilt, 1688, Orinoco or The Royal Slave, 1688, The History of the Nun, 1689, and The Lucky Mistake, 1689, the year that she died. She also translated from French and Latin, including works by La Rochefoucauld and Fontenelle. Aphra Behn died on the 16th of April 1689 and is buried in the East Cloister at Westminster Abbey with the inscription, "Here lies a proof that wit can never be defence enough against mortality." She has been quoted as having believed herself to have led a life dedicated to pleasure and poetry. Her work fell from favour, as we mentioned, and was considered scandalous by the 18th century, but interest in Behn revived in the mid-20th century and still exists today. Orinoco, or The Royal Slave by Aphra Behn, is about an African prince found himself sold into slavery due to the perfidy of some Europeans whom he encounters. Orinoco, or The Royal Slave, and you can see here that Aphra Behn purported that it was a true story. It was published in 1688 as a work of prose, and it was also adapted into a play later. Orinoco is an African prince tricked into slavery who ends up in Suriname, a Dutch plantation colony in the Guianas, where it's believed that Aphra Behn herself lived for a time. The narrator of the work, a woman whom Orinoco meets in the colony, is thought to reflect Behn herself, and she views the indigenous inhabitants as living an idyll of innocence. The text is thought of as one of the earliest English novels. A popular theatrical adaptation by Irish dramatist Thomas Southern was performed regularly in England throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. A synopsis of the story. The author describes the colony and inhabitants of Suriname, incorporating the tale of Coromantian Prince Orinoco, the grandson of an African king. The prince trained from battle from a young age and was a military leader by the age of 17. His best general takes an arrow for him during a heated battle, and Orinoco takes his place to lead his troops. After the battle, Orinoco goes to visit the daughter of the general, Imawenda, to offer her trophies for her father's victories. He falls in love with her and later asks her to marry him. The king hears a description of Imawenda as the most beautiful woman in the country and also falls in love with her. He forces her to become one of the royal wives, in other words, to enter his harem, even though he's aware of her betrothal to Orinoco. Orinoco comforts himself with the thought that the king is too old to force Imawenda into any kind of sexual activity. With the help of another of the king's wives, Onahal, and Orinoco's friend Aboan, the pair begin an affair. They are discovered, though, and in retribution, Imawenda and Onahal are sold as slaves. To comfort Orinoco, his grandfather tells him that Imawenda has been executed, a less undignified fate than slavery. Another tribal war takes place, after which Orinoco and his men visit the ship of a European slave trader. They are tricked into slavery and shackled whilst drunk. The slave trader carries them to Suriname in the West Indies, intending to sell them. Orinoco is given preferential treatment by his owner, Treffry, who's a Cornishman, since he can speak French and English. Treffry tells Orinoco that he had owned a very beautiful slave woman and had to stop himself from raping her. He is speaking of Imawenda, although Orinoco doesn't know that at the time. The two lovers are reunited on the plantation, where they are known as Caesar and Clemeny. Treffry treats the prince as an honoured guest, and the narrator recounts amusing episodes involving hunting, reading and visiting native villages. Orinoco and Imoenda are permitted to share a cottage and to live as man and wife, but when Imoenda becomes pregnant, Orinoco asks Treffry to permit them to return to their homeland. Treffry puts them off with stories of the imminent arrival of the governor, and in the end, Orinoco organises a slave revolt. The slaves, including Imoenda, fight hard, but most capitulate when the deputy governor offers them amnesty. The deputy governor, Byam, orders the slaves to whip Orinoco and his second-in-command, Tuscan. Orinoco vows to kill Byam, although he worries that Imoenda would be vulnerable should Orinoco die and not be there to protect her. She and her husband decide that he should kill her, which he does. Orinoco mourns and he becomes weak, hiding in the woods. Physically weak, that is. He cannot complete his revenge. When discovered, rather than be killed by his oppressors, he cuts off some of his own throat, disembowels himself and stabs the first man who approaches him. He's captured and tied to a post where he is quartered and dismembered. The narration of the novel is both first person and third person, with the narrator telling the story of Orinoco and Imoenda as she apparently learned it from meeting indigenous locals and slaves. She returns to London at the end of the novel, and she claims to be writing about real events. Some readers of the novel assumed that it depicted Behn's own life and it became part of her legend. Scholars cannot say for sure whether or not it is biographical. All the Europeans featured in the novel really did live in Suriname at the time, but on the other hand, she could have learned details of the colony from the writings of William Byam and George Warren, which were in circulation in London in the 1660s. Behn was very much a royalist, and her fictional Suriname flounders without a king at the helm. Also, we see her reverence for Orinoco as a prince. The novel's reminders of Dutch atrocities in Suriname came at a time when the Dutch William of Orange, married to James VII and II's daughter Mary, was supported by some to replace James on the throne. Behn was a committed Tory as well as a royalist, which may have been why she chose to tell this story 24 years after she had lived in the colonies. In the 18th century, the novel was read in the light of growing concerns over slavery. It's not really clear that Behn was anti-slavery, though. We can't be sure that that was her intention in the novel. In 1899, though, Wilbur L. Cross stated Orinoco is the first humanitarian novel in English. He construed Behn's purpose as having been the abolition of slavery. Behn became to be viewed as a forerunner to Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was of course a key piece of literature in the abolitionist cause in the United States. It so happened that Behn's husband, John Behn, had been himself a slave trader, and so we could assume that she wouldn't have married a slave trader if she had been opposed to slavery, but maybe she became so after her connection with him, we just don't know. In the 20th century, her depiction of African characters seemed to typify the idea of the so-called noble savage. She was also construed as a proto-feminist. Her work is now viewed in the context of the politics of her time, especially her questioning of noble blood whilst upholding the value of kingship. The noble-born Orinoco is pitted against those with noble blood but no real leadership qualities, whereas Orinoco, the prince, inspires loyalty, both as a prince and as a slave, of course. The narrator on meeting Orinoco says he was adorned with a native beauty, so transcending all those of his gloomy race that he struck an awe and reverence even into those that knew not his quality, as he did into me, who beheld him with surprise and wonder when afterwards he arrived in our world. And I have observed 'tis a very great error in those who laugh when one says, a negro can change colour, for I have seen him as frequently blush and look pale, and that as visibly as ever I saw in the most beautiful white, and 'tis certain that both these changes were evident this day in both these lovers. To describe her truly, one need say only, she was female to the noble male, the beautiful black Venus to our young Mars, as charming in her person as he, and of delicate virtues. I have seen 100 white men sighing after her, and making 1,000 vows at her feet, all in vain and unsuccessful. So that is Behn's description of Imoenda, so beautiful that even white men chased after her. It's a bit uncomfortable, isn't it? Let's be honest. This is the view on the work by Laura J. Rosenthal in her Orinoco Reception Ideology and Narrative Strategy, published by the Cambridge University Press. And she says, the English promise but never deliver freedom for Orinoco and his wife Imawinda. Orinoco's royalty means that he does not suffer the usual hardships of slavery. Still, he longs for release. Imawinda's pregnancy brings the narrative to a crisis over the fate of their child. Orinoco leads a rebellion to secure their liberty, but it fails due to the lack of resolve among the other slaves. The wives beg their husbands to stop fighting. As in Orinoco's story, domestic interests compete with the defence of honour. A description of the views of Ross Appleton in Orinoco, an emergent anti-colonial voice, published on Brighton University's website. Orinoco is a story recounted by a woman and written by a woman. Appleton states that this unquestionable authority over the narrative transgresses the rigid gender boundaries of the early modern literary landscape. Behn equates the enslavement of Africans with the oppression of women. Appleton argues that it is the unique blend of feminism and colonial critique that give Orinoco a unique radical stance on colonialism. Aphra Behn was, after all, a dramatist, so let's look at her most famous play, The Rover. Otherwise known as The Rover or The Banished Cavaliers. It's a play in two parts, and it's a revision of Thomas Killigrew's Tommaso or The Wanderer, published in 1664. It premiered on the 24th of March 1677, and it tells the story of the romantic escapades and intrigues of an English group of young men and some Italian women in Naples during a carnival. And the carnival setting allows for the idea of masked identity. And that comes a lot from the Elizabethan period and from Shakespeare, still popular in the Restoration. In Dryden's view, the play lacks the manly vitality of Killigrew's play, but shows greater refinement of expression. Critic Susan Carlson tells us the play stood for 3 centuries as Behn's most popular and most respected play. Sisters Helena and Florinda have had their futures decided for them by their father and brother. Helena is to enter a convent after the carnival, and their father wants Florinda to marry the aged Don Vincentio, and their brother Don Pedro wants her to marry Don Antonio. Florinda is in love with an English colonel, though, Belleville. The women dress up in carnival wear in order to try and escape their family's plans. It allows them to dress up in disguise, basically. Florinda, Helena and their cousin Valeria encounter an English party. Wilmore, Belleville, Frederick and Blunt at the carnival. Wilmore and Helena flirt and agree to meet again. Blunt becomes the object of Lucetta's affections, and Florinda arranges a meeting with Belleville, and then her brother arrives. She gives Belleville a letter and rushes away with Helena and Valeria. The letter gives Belleville instructions to find her in her garden that night and elope with her. Blunt sneaks away with Lucetta. Wilmore, Belleville and Frederick go to see a famous courtesan, Angelica. Her servants hang her portrait outside her house. The Englishmen are amazed by her beauty, but they can't afford her services. Don Pedro enters the house and sees her picture. He can afford her services and runs off to fetch the money. Angelica bemoans the fact that no one has taken her up because the price is too high, but then learns that Don Pedro and Don Antonio are rich and decides to pursue them. Pedro and Antonio enter masked from each side of the stage. Antonio wonders aloud if he could get away with associating with Angelica but still marry Florinda. Pedro recognises him when he mentions Florinda and a fight breaks out. Wilmore and Blunt try to break it up. Pedro challenges Antonio to a duel the next day and Antonio accepts. Meanwhile, Wilmore sees a smaller picture of Angelica and tries to steal it. Antonio tells him to put it back, but Wilmore refuses, saying Antonio can afford to buy the real lady. Angelica enters as another fight breaks out. Angelica is impressed by Wilmore and asks him to speak to her inside the house. Belleville and Frederick think she is angry with Wilmore and try to dissuade him, but he goes with her anyway. Wilmore tries to convince Angelica to let him have a freebie, to put it bluntly. Smitten with his wit, Angelica agrees, despite the misgivings of her servant Moretta. Helena has also fallen for Wilmore, and the women see Belleville, Blunt and Frederick and eavesdrop on them. They have come to find Wilmore as he has been with Angelica for 2 hours. Wilmore comes out and brags about the freebie. Helena comes out of hiding and pretends she is not overheard. Wilmore flirts with her again, and Angelica enters masked and sees Wilmore chatting up another woman despite having made vows to her. Helena reveals her face to Wilmore, who praises her beauty. Angelica loses it. She orders a servant to find out who Helena is and storms off in a rage. Helena asks Wilmore what he got up to at Angelica's house, but he denies everything. Helena flies at him, quoting his bragging about Angelica. Florinda and Valeria test Belleville's loyalty to Florinda by trying to seduce him in disguise, but he doesn't give in and the women exit. Florinda gives Belleville a locket. He recognises her picture in it and decides to rescue her that night with the aid of Wilmore and Frederick. Blunt is scammed out of his money and clothes by Lucetta. Later, Florinda waits in her garden in her night attire. Wilmore mistakes her for a prostitute and tries to scam another freebie, basically. He tries to rape her when she resists. Belleville and Frederick enter and he runs off. Wilmore and Belleville nearly come to blows, but Frederick intervenes. Wilmore explains he thought Florinda was a prostitute and Belleville and Frederick leave to find her. So that's okay then if you thought she was a prostitute. I mean, it's a bit distasteful from our age, isn't it? Well, it should have been distasteful then. Antonio enters hoping that his page has paid Angelica so he can enjoy her services. Wilmore starts a fight with him and Antonio is wounded. Wilmore believes him to be dead and runs away. Belleville rushes in believing Wilmore to have been hurt. Soldiers enter and arrest Belleville, believing him to be the attacker. Antonio orders Belleville to be taken to his house. Antonio believes it was Belleville who injured him, but offers him an alternative to imprisonment. Belleville is to dress as Antonio and take his place in the duel with Pedro. Belleville agrees as he believes the fight is over Florinda. Florinda is distressed that Belleville did not come to her as planned and is worried that the duel is to be between Belleville and Pedro. A masked Pedro enters and declared that he will be fighting Antonio, which is a comfort to Florinda. Belleville enters disguised as Antonio and Florinda rushes to stop the fight, and Belleville is confused as to why she would defend his rival. They fight anyway and Belinda stops them again just as Belleville disarms Pedro. She begs him to spare Pedro. Belleville lays his sword at her feet and swears his love. This assuages Pedro, who gives his sister to the man he believes to be Antonio, demanding that they marry at once. Florinda protests, but Belleville secretly reveals his identity. Wilmore and Frederick enter. When Wilmore embraces Belleville, he drops his mask. Furious, Belleville chases Wilmore away. Angelica arrives with Moretta and another servant, Sebastian. She is infuriated by Wilmore's flirtation with Helena. Sebastian chases Wilmore to bring him back, and Angelica accuses him of cheating on her. Wilmore attempts to charm her. Helena enters disguised as a man. She approaches Angelica pretending to be one of Helena's servants. She tells a tale of a girl who fell in love but was jilted at the altar as her fiancé had fallen for Angelica's charms. She reveals the lover to be Wilmore. Angelica is moved, whilst Wilmore wants to find out who the woman in the story is. Wilmore then recognises Helena. He tells Angelica that Helena is ugly, a gypsy and a monkey. He orders Helena to go back to her mistress. Outraged, Angelica threatens to take revenge on Wilmore and sends him away. He exits with an aside that he plans to win back Helena, whom he's just called ugly and a monkey and the rest of it. Belleville, Wilmore, Frederick and Pedro break into Blunt's room and laugh at him. He says he has only just had a wench in his room and shows them the ring Florinda gave him. Belleville recognises it as the ring he gave Florinda when they exchanged vows. Unaware that this servant is Florinda, the other men demand that Blunt let her out so that they can have their way with her. The person with the longest sword will have her first. That's quite a nasty sort of phallic imagery there. And it turns out to be Don Pedro. unfortunately Florinda's brother. He unlocks Florinda's door. Masked Florinda runs in, pursued by her brother. She is saved when Valeria arrives to tell Pedro that Florinda's whereabouts have been discovered. He goes, and Florinda removes her mask. Valeria tells Belleville and Florinda they must marry quickly before Pedro returns. Frederick and Valeria decide to marry as well. Belleville sends a boy to find a priest. Frederick and Blunt apologise for intending to rape Florinda, and Blunt returns her ring. Florinda forgives them. The two couples exit to get married, and Blunt goes to the tailor's. Wilmore stays behind to keep watch for Pedro's return. Angelica enters, pointing a pistol at Wilmore. She has a bit of a rant whilst waving a gun. Wilmore offers to pay for the services he has taken, but she refuses. Just as she is about to kill him, Antonio enters with his arm in a sling. He takes the gun and recognises Wilmore as the man who stole the picture. He offers to shoot Wilmore. Pedro enters, and Angelica decides not to kill Wilmore and leaves. Pedro asks why Antonio missed the duel. He explains, then leaves in a temper. Pedro decides to give Florinda to Belleville as revenge. Wilmore informs him that they are already married, and Pedro exits. Helena enters still dressed as a boy servant. She flirts once again with Wilmore, who would like to sleep with her, but has no intention of marrying her. Helena finally convinces him to marry her. Pedro, Valeria, Belleville, Florinda and Frederick enter. Pedro approves of Helena's engagement, as he is tired of worrying about his sister's honour. Blunt enters looking ridiculous in a Spanish habit, because of course his own clothes have been stolen, as music plays and carnival dancers perform. The play ends with a vow of love between Helena and Wilmore. Here's some thoughts on The Rover. The first from the Times Literary Supplement. The first English woman to earn her living as a creative writer, Behn fashioned for herself in poetry and prefaces a shape-shifting image of female linguistic power, bisexuality and heterosexual abjection, the immodesty of which shocked succeeding centuries before coming into its own in the 20th. Her Tory royalist politics and contempt for democracy might now seem problematic, but her attitudes were forged in the repressive years of Puritan and Republican rule following the Civil War, and she was aware of the darker aspects of the causes she supported, particularly as they applied to women. This is from Mass Criticism, the whore and the breeches' role as articulators of sexual economic theory in the intrigue plays of Aphra Behn. The men are no longer looking for sexual playmates, but marriageable women with large fortunes to secure their own futures. The breeches' role and the role of the whore perform the same function. They embody the idea of women for sale, women on display. The whore does that within the text. The breeches role displayed the legs of the actress in a provocative way that was as much advertisement for the actress's sexual availability as the vizard masks which real prostitutes wore in the streets. The vizard becomes an emblem of Behn's dramatic technique. As the vizard both marks and masks the identity of the wearer, the spectacle of woman for sale, as both whore and breeches role, both articulates and masks Behn's critique.